We're on page 70. That's where we are. Page 70.
The women are on page 90.
And within page 70 itself, just if you want to know exactly where we are, so it is 5 lines on the top of the page. There's a little full stop straight after the little abbreviation, and that's where we are. So let's just remind ourselves what it is that we're talking about. This is the chapter in which the Alter Rebbe said, listen, there's some core principles that you have to know about spiritual growth and development, particularly if you would like to be a Beinoni. So I'm assuming that obviously everybody here would like to be a Beinoni. Otherwise, what's the point?
Maybe not in this
lifetime. So there's it could be in this lifetime. Just got to try a bit harder. So anyhow, the point is, if you want to be a Beinoni, the things that you have to know are that there are 2 fundamental principles for the Beinoni. And the 2 fundamental principles that we have started to learn are, number 1, that the mind has to take control. We can't just follow our hearts. I know that it's very attractive and everybody likes to, this is where you play the organ music in the background, so, follow your heart and everything's going to be wonderful. But at the end of the day, what we've learned is that the real power lies in the mind. And if a person is able to get their mind right, then they're able to direct their heart. The problem is, and this is what brings us to the second principle, that not all of us have that level of discipline. And not all of us have that level of focus. And so we don't necessarily have the opportunity or the wherewithal to be able to sit and focus and get our minds right and contemplate the greatness of Hashem as we're supposed to. So the big question was, what do we do in the interim? What do you do until you get there? And that's really where we are in our conversation right now. And it's very, very interesting because essentially what we're learning at the moment is that, and we spend quite a bit of time talking about this, that there's a difference between the things that you know so well that they actually seep into your feelings and the things that you just acknowledge intellectually that, this is the right thing to do, even if I'm not necessarily feeling it. And so we had a whole therapy session about the importance of taking flowers for your wife, even if you don't necessarily appreciate the value of flowers. And I'm told that since last week, a lot of people got flowers for Shabbos.
Oh, really?
And so we're, that's it. We're on the right path. We're all on the right path. So that was just obviously an illustration of the point. I want to share something else just before we delve in over here, and that is that generally speaking, when it comes to the experience of feelings, now we're being very careful over here, and I'm using generic terms, feelings, emotions, but the truth of the matter is we're talking about any personal response that a person has to whatever's coming at them in their lives. So when it comes to that, the truth of the matter is that there are 3 states of emotional development. And this is quite valuable information before we delve into what it is we're going to be doing today. But there are 3 states of emotional development, and it's extremely, extremely useful to know this. And in Jewish mystical teachings, we call them, you ready for this? You ready? Okay, so we're going to call them, essentially we're going to link them to the process of the maturing and eventual independence of a baby. So the 3 stages we call Ibur, Yenika, and Moichim. Okay? So now we're going to translate those things. What do they mean? So the translation of Ibur is pregnancy. Yenika is feeding, is sucking, is being nurtured. The actual meaning of the word Yenika is to be nurtured, right? And the 3rd stage is Moichin, which is intellect. Moach is the brain. Moichin in the plural are the various elements of intellect. Now, basically what that means, if you think about it, so the very first stage of a baby's development is in utero. The next stage is after the baby is born, but even after the baby is born, the baby is completely reliant on the parent, on the mother specifically, in order to be able to survive. The big difference between pregnancy and after birth, newborn phase, is that in the state of pregnancy, even though the baby is 100% dependent on the mother in order to survive, the baby has no real proactive participation in that. Whereas the newborn phase, the baby cries and then the mother feeds the baby. Okay, so there's some development over here, there's some maturing, there's some growth, there's some independent participation. The ultimate state in that stage of development is when a child starts to eat solids And at that point, the child develops a more mature understanding of the world. In fact, the Gemara says that a baby is not able to say Abba, which obviously is one of the first words that you learn, right? It's a lot harder for English-speaking babies, right? So a baby is not able to say Abba until the baby has tasted wheat. That's what the Gemara says, and implying that there's a certain developmental phase which is associated with eating solids. And really, at that point, the baby starts to develop a certain degree of independence that is beyond the independence that it had before. So in the development of a person's emotional state, we can identify that a person also goes through 3 stages of emotional development and maturity. And this is really fascinating. So one is comparable to pregnancy, one is comparable to the nursing stage, and one is comparable to the stage where a person has a developed mind. What does that mean? So effectively, it means this. The least developed kind of emotional experience that a person has, or let's even just say the least developed kind of emotion that a person has, is that they don't really feel the emotion, but they subscribe to the behavior associated with that particular emotion because it's societally acceptable, or because they understand that it's appropriate to do, etc. So for example, let's just say in our society, one of the things that happens is that people acknowledge that you're supposed to greet people and ask them how they are, right? So what do? We say, hello, how are you? Why? Because that's something that we've been conditioned to do. It's a societally acceptable behavior. So that's what people do. Is there a deep emotion associated with that? Not necessarily. The person doesn't necessarily feel or care about how the other person is. They just simply do because that's what we're supposed to do. So we kind of accept that that's the emotion that we're supposed to have. Something a lot deeper than that is what we call yanika. Yanika means that it's kind of nurtured into me. It's kind of built into me. That refers to the kind of emotion that a person has that's actually part of their persona. For example, a person who is a kind person. So kindness is an emotion, it's a virtue. And here's somebody who has that kindness because they are, that's who they are. It's part and parcel of who they are. Now, here's the big thing, and that's going to speak directly to what it is that we're learning about, both generally in this chapter and specifically in the next piece. The big thing is that most people believe that if you are wired in a particular way, for example, let's say that a person happens to be a kind person, and people think, that's great, look at me, I'm a kind person, and so people should respect me for that, or people should celebrate the fact that I'm kind, etc., etc. Torah does not agree with that. Torah says that's not your doing, that's your gift. You can't take credit for your gift. You didn't choose how what kind of personality you were going to have. That's what Hashem did for you. So, what are you getting so excited about? Thank you very much. That's like the person who says that they deserve accolades because of the way that they look. Well, you don't choose how you look. I mean, you can, I suppose. You can go and pay some money and choose how to look. But generally speaking, the way that Hashem designed some people to look nicer than other people. That's just the way it is. It's not something that a person should become all full of themselves for. As far as Judaism is concerned, the ultimate state of emotional being is when a person develops an emotion because they understand the value of that emotion. So, for example, where a person develops love because they understand the value of that love in that relationship. Now, we're not going to do a whole talk over here about relationships and marriage and all that stuff, even though it will probably bring a lot more people through the door. But at the end of the day, if you think about it, we live in a world that celebrates romantic love, and romantic love basically means that it's all about emotion. This is the emotion the person has, and they see somebody and they kind of resonate, etc., etc. But the longevity of a relationship, the longevity of marriage, for example, has little to do with feelings and everything to do with getting your head right. If you get your head right, then you also learn to love things about that person that were not necessarily originally apparent to you or originally attractive to you. So the ultimate state is moichin, is using the mind in order to develop emotions. That's exactly what the Alter Rebbe told us over here in the first part of this chapter. That if you really want to become a developed human being, and you really want to become a spiritual superstar, and you want to become a Beinoni, then what you've got to be able to do is use your mind to direct, develop, mature the feelings of your heart. So that instead of just feeling excited about the things that make humans excited, you should actually get excited about God. In fact, just another perspective on this, just for interest's sake, just to deepen our perspective. So let me ask you this. Would you agree that human beings generally are pleasure-seeking creatures?
Yeah, sure.
You'd agree with that, right? You'd agree with that. I can prove it to you. I can prove it to you? Very simple. Because people come to a Tanya Chapter, and what happens? You bring out a little bit of sweet stuff, Everybody's a lot more excited than they were about the Tanya Shir, because we are pleasure-seeking creatures. That's just the nature of the human being, right? Pleasure-seeking creatures. Now here's the question. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Depends where you find your pleasure.
Depends where you find your pleasure, right? Good. Depends where you find your pleasure. So there are certain religious practices and disciplines where the entire religious discipline or spiritual discipline is built on trying to cancel your pleasures, escape your pleasures. So become, live the monastic life and don't talk and don't get married and eat bread and salt and whatever, like that kind of stuff. Judaism has a very unique approach. Judaism says, and this is fascinating, Judaism says you have to realize the fact that Hashem wired us to be such pleasure-seeking creatures is because seeking pleasure is not a bad thing. As you said, it depends what pleasure you're seeking. So the concept of wanting to have the satisfaction or the pleasure of beautiful or meaningful experiences is beautiful once you can train yourself to recognize that holy experiences are beautiful and pleasurable experiences. Or to put it differently, if you had to speak to your neshama before it came into this world and before it inhabited a body, it also had a tremendous drive for a very powerful kind of pleasure, the pleasure of being in Hashem's presence. And that's really the language that the neshama speaks. Because the neshama had to invest into a human body, and the human being doesn't naturally resonate with those kinds of things, so the pleasure got misdirected into other areas. So rather than killing the concept of pleasure, we've got to use our minds in order to understand and appreciate where true excitement should come from, where true love should be directed, etc. So that's what we're saying over here. So if a person uses their mind, they can get themselves into a completely different emotional state. Fascinating. Where it's actually possible that the things that get us up in the morning would be things of a holy nature rather than the things of a materialistic nature. It's actually possible. Why? Because the minute we recognize that the pleasure drive that we have comes from a very positive potential source, then we can redirect it. As long as we think it's a distraction and only a distraction, well, what can you do with that other than to say, get out of my way? Okay, so it's a very interesting development. Now, in this part where we are now, is the Alter Rebbe said, but what happens if you're not yet at the stage you could use such focused intention and you can get your mind to redirect your feelings? Because that's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take a lot of consistency and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of attention and a lot of focus and a lot of maturity. So not everybody's going to get there. So what do we do in the interim? And so we've started to learn about the fact that there's something called tevuna. It's going to be a word that comes up again in the piece we're going to be learning this evening. And tevuna is related to the word lehitbonen, right? Or hisboinenus, as we call it in Chassidus. And that is an intellectual process where a person laser focuses their mind for a period of time without interruption on the development of a concept in their mind. This is not learning. Learning is learning. This is when I've already learnt the information, and now I'm allowing myself to completely immerse in what I've learned to the extent that it actually starts to take shape in my head as a reality rather than as a theory. Very often when we learn things, they sound great in theory. When we are misboinen, when we contemplate things, they actually start to become more real to us. So tevuna is the state of understanding that a person has after they have spent some time contemplating on an idea, before that contemplation is powerful enough to actually shift their emotional state. That's what tevuna is. No, bina is part of the intellectual process. Tevuna is the bridge between the intellectual process and the emotional response to that intellectual process. So it's quite a different thing. Okay? All right. So with that in mind, we spoke last time that with a little bit of focus and a little bit of contemplation, we come to realize that ultimately what my neshama wants is to connect to Hashem. And really my neshama is kind of locked into this human experience where it's like handcuffed and it's unable to achieve what it really wants to achieve. When I realize that, at least if I'm not feeling it, I can acknowledge conceptually that it is worth having a relationship with Hashem, even if I'm not currently feeling the extent of that relationship. So, with that introduction, let's have a look where we are, which is 5 lines from the top of the page. If you're looking on the screen, it's almost exactly the same, actually. 6 lines from the top of the page. And the first word on the line was the acronym Hey Nun Lamed Hanal. Then there's a full stop, and we're straight after that. The Ila Zois, once a person has this awareness, then the person's motivation is going to be to embrace Hashem with everything that I have. Even if I don't feel that that's what I should do, I understand and acknowledge that that's what I should do. That I should really embrace Hashem with every fiber of my being. How do you embrace Hashem? Well, no surprises here. The way to do that is Dahainu Kiyum Atar Mitzvahs. That's by fulfilling the 613 mitzvahs through the 3 channels of human experience, which are B'maiseh, Uvedibur, Uvemachshava. Right? Which is through the process of the thought process, through speaking about these things, and through doing these things. In other words, there are certain mitzvahs that are mitzvahs of thought, certain mitzvahs that are mitzvahs of speech, and the majority of mitzvahs are mitzvahs of action. So let's just do a quick test. Which mitzvah would you say is a mitzvah of thought?
Praying.
Praying is not I knew somebody was going to say that. Praying is a hybrid, because praying is very much about intention, which is thought, so you're right about that. But you only fulfill the mitzvah of praying when you say the words, so it needs to have both. Right, so it's a mitzvah of a hybrid of thought and of words. But that's a good point. So praying is very much about thought. What other mitzvahs of thought are there? It's quite valuable for us to know this, by the way. Okay? So we're told that there are certain mitzvahs that a person, there's actually 6 mitzvahs that a person can do on a continuous basis, and some of those mitzvahs are thought mitzvahs. Like, for example, knowing Hashem. That's a thought mitzvah. Right? The Torah does not tell us that we have a mitzvah to believe in Hashem. It's assumed that if you're already looking at what the Torah has to say, you believe in Hashem. So the mitzvah is to know Hashem. That's a thought mitzvah. Okay, a speech mitzvah. What's a speech mitzvah? Now I know what everybody's going to say. What's a speech mitzvah?
Right.
Well, no, we just said davening, right?
No, but not
right? So, saying a brocha is a form of prayer. Rosh Hashanah. I thought that's what I was expecting. I was expecting that everybody was going to say Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't matter. It's still a mitzvah that is associated with speech. But the other mitzvah, the positive mitzvah that is associated with speech is, believe it or not, learning Torah. Because it is only considered the mitzvah of learning Torah when you're saying the words. So if you're just reading a book as if it were a novel, that is not the mitzvah of learning Torah. You actually have to say the words. Interesting, right?
Further as to about saying the words, meaning like a rabbi teaching someone?
No. When you're reading a text, a Torah text, you actually have to say the words in order to fulfill the mitzvah. So that's interesting, right? And then action, okay, it goes without saying, most of the mitzvahs are action-based mitzvahs. So I have to at least acknowledge, even if I'm not feeling this in a compelling way, I have to at least acknowledge intellectually that the most valuable thing in the world is to be in Hashem's embrace. How do I get there? By engaging in Torah and mitzvahs, which use these 3 channels, thought, speech, and action. Let's continue. Shehi hasoga svitiras haTorah kenal. As mentioned before, this is firstly built on understanding and knowing the Torah, obviously. Okay, now let's get to the point. You ready for this? Now we're going to talk about us, or maybe not. We're going to talk about where we could get to, even if we're not at this ultimate Beinoni level, because this is going to be really relatable stuff. So what does he say? When a person really pays attention to these concepts, which are the value of a connection to Hashem, that really what my neshama wants more than anything else is to have a deep, meaningful relationship with Hashem. That's who the real me is. Right? The real me is dedicated to a meaningful connection to Hashem. So I know that very well. Kishamamik, I delve deeply into this concept. Using the deeper recesses or the deeper traits of my mind and of my heart to be able to truly understand the concept. And look what happens over here. Upiv veliboy shavin. And I reach the point that my mouth and my heart are the same. That is essentially saying I have integrity. So hypocrisy is echad bepeh ve'echad belev. I have one sentiment in my heart and I have another thing that I say, which unfortunately is extremely common. Right, where people say things that their heart is not necessarily into it. And one of the main times that people do that is when they're put under pressure. If somebody says, so, do you think this is a good idea? And then you say, yes, of course, Or, for example, when the wife says to the husband, do I look okay in this outfit? And then the husband realizes he doesn't have much option, but he's just got to say, yes, of course.
It's not always
So
the right answer.
it's not always the right answer, exactly. So that's what we call echad bepeh ve'echad belev. One thing, what you feel and believe in your heart, and something else that you say, that would illustrate a lack of integrity. Now, when it comes to our spiritual experiences, the one thing that we should try as best as we can to avoid is that. If I'm talking about spiritual growth, the last thing I want is to be echad bepeh ve'echad belev. So I have my stated spiritual values, and then I have my lived spiritual values, and they don't speak to each other. And that's the kind of thing that really gets us upset. And we say, oh, look at this person, they're such a hypocrite, and what's wrong with them? They speak a big game, and they say how frum they are, whatever the case is, but look at their behavior, right? Have you ever heard somebody say that, right? Of course, people say that, right? So I don't want to be that person. And therefore, if I'm going to really look to grow spiritually and to develop my connection to Hashem, then I want to have piv, v'liboy, shavin. I want to have the mouth and the heart on the same page, on the same channel, on the same wavelength. I want to make sure that what I'm saying is what I'm feeling, and what I'm feeling is what I'm saying. Just by the way, parenthetically, the first time that we really encounter this idea of not being echad bepeh ve'echad belev is with Yosef and his brothers, where we were told that the brothers were outright. They said to him directly, we don't want to hear your stories. We don't agree with your dreams, etc. They were not. The Torah actually, well, at least the commentaries, Rashi brings it, etc. They actually bring it as an accolade that here were people who they refused to play the political game to make it seem like they were happy in a situation where they were unhappy. So they were straight. They said it directly. We don't approve of what you're doing. We think you're off the mark. So that's an illustration of this point. So if a person wants to advance their spirituality, one of the key things is integrity. There's got to be an alignment between the things that I say, that I claim to believe, and the things that I actually feel inside. Okay?
And the actions.
Well, actions, for some reason, he doesn't bring actions over here. He says specifically that that you've got to have your heart and your mouth have to be aligned. And probably the reason for that is because in Judaism, if a person does an action and they don't have their mind, their heart in it, they still get the value of the mitzvah. So that's most likely the reason why he doesn't do that, right? So what does that mean? But here you're going to see that it does cross over into the world of action. This is a person who affects, in reality, the things that they believe in principle. Which means, you ready for this? This is all of us. You ready? This is all of us. I know what that means is, that means that the thing that you should care about the most and you should want the most in your life is Torah. Needless to say, that applies obviously to everybody who's here. What's the proof? Because you're here. Right? Otherwise, if it was Netflix, that was the thing that you wanted the most, lahavdil, then you'd be right now doing Netflix. So what did we say that a person, but obviously I'm being a little bit facetious, because over here what he says is, the Yos Vaseres Hashem Cheftzoi means that the one and only priority of what this person wants is Torah. And halavai, we could say that about ourselves, that our highest priority over all else is Torah. I remember a number of years ago, sitting at a school sports day, and one of the parents was sitting there. You know how it is, all the parents sit there and they're cheering their kids on, and depending on what kind of parents, some of them are screaming and yelling. Some people are yelling at their kids, some people are yelling at other people's kids, some people are yelling at the referees or whoever it is, Anyhow, so all of this chaos is going on, and this and that, and there's cheers, and it was a sports day, so this house is screaming at that house, and this guy was sitting there in the bleachers with his Gemara, totally oblivious to the whole scene. It was a fascinating thing to watch. He was completely absorbed in his Gemara. So I don't know what his kid thought about that, but the fact is that that's what he wanted to do. So he had to be there because he had to be there. But what he wanted to do is he wanted to be in his Gemara. Okay? So that would be an illustration of this idea. Now, before you judge him and say, but you're supposed to be there and your kid is waiting for you, trust me, half the other parents were on their phones. So, this is not a question of whether you're there for your kid or not. This is a question of whether your primary focus in life is social media or your primary focus in life is Gemara. Of course they were learning from their cell phones. Of course. I could hear the sound of all. I could hear the sound of all the shiurim they were listening to on their social media. Okay. Anyway. Not only should it be cheftzoi, not only should it be what you want, but But that has to, again, we said piv v'libo shav, and it's not just good enough to have good sentiment. It's got to actually be aligned with what we're saying and doing. And so therefore he says, how do you know that a person really wants to learn Torah? Simple, because that's what they do. And he says, yoimam v'layla, day and night. Now, for some people, when they hear the expression that you should learn Torah day and night, people think, oh my gosh, I'm panicking because at night, I'm tired at night. You know how it is. We have busy lives and we come back at the end of the day and we're completely wrung out. That's why some people don't get to the shiur, right? Because people are exhausted at this time of the day. So in some people's minds, to learn during the day seems like a more relevant proposition. The only thing is, who's got time during the day? So you've actually got to think about this for a moment. Which is the greater challenge? Is the greater challenge to learn Torah at night, or is the greater challenge to learn Torah during the day? And on analysis, I would say that the average person would say both of them are absolutely challenging in our modern lifestyle. So if you turn the clock back 100 years, it was a very different lifestyle. What do people have to do at night? Not a whole lot.
There were
So,
no TVs, no
exactly.
cell phones.
So what did you do at night? You could take out your Gemara. You could learn your Gemara. It wasn't such a big, there wasn't such a major distraction that you were fighting against. Besides the fact, if you go back even slightly earlier than that, let's say you went back now 200 years, by the time nightfall came, your candle lasted for a short period of time. That was that. Then you went to sleep. And you woke up at the crack of dawn because that's just how things worked. And books are not freely available, that's true. But you had, and by the way, to that point, when people studied Torah, they usually did not study at home. They had to go to a central place where people had books and whatever the case is, I'm saying it was already, now you're talking after the advent of the printing press, but still things were not nearly as available. When you talk about a library, who had libraries in those days? You had to be a wealthy person to be able to have a library. But the point of the matter is that even if they had the same book that they relearned again and again and again and again, they were dedicated to learning. That's the point. They were dedicated to learning Torah. Whereas in today, and then even work-wise, you didn't clock in at work at 7, 8 a.m. in the morning. People, whatever, if you worked in the field. So you had very early mornings during those seasons. And then there were other seasons where you didn't go to the field at all. And you had months where you were kind of free, to be able to do your learning. It's only in our environment, I don't know if you ever heard this, I can't remember who said it, but somebody gave a really simple summary of how human lifestyles have changed. So before the Industrial Revolution, the locus was home. So the concept was home, work, home. In other words, your base was your home, and then occasionally you went out to work because in an agricultural society you had to go at certain times to be able to plant, to be able to care for your field, irrigate your field, harvest your field, deliver the things, etc. Maybe you were a water carrier, so there were certain times you had to do it, but your focal point of your life was home. After the Industrial Revolution, and particularly in the corporate environment, it became work, home, work, which means that people were spending most of their waking hours in the work environment, most days of the week. And when you came home, it was like a nice to have. You just be able to come home at the end of the day and kind of unwind a little bit. Now, in the technological era, it's work, work, work. Because even when a person is in their bed at home, they could still be replying to emails, checking up on the particular product or whatever the case is. There's no break. So in that context, it sounds very difficult for us to be able to say, but Yega bo yom v'layla, that you should learn Torah day and night. And so I'd suggest that in today's world, the challenge of learning Torah is equally a challenge during the day as it is during the night, because we have such frenetic lifestyles that you've actually got to carve out that time for Torah. It's got to be a conscious decision, because it's not something that happens naturally and it's not something that happens easily. So when somebody says of a Hashem Chefzo, that their entire focus and their interest in life is to learn Hashem's Torah, how do I know that that's true? Because they will find that time. They will find that time. Because what's fascinating? When we actually do an audit of our time, we realize that there's a fair amount of our time that could be used differently and in a Torah context more productively. For example, we spend an inordinate amount of time in our cars. And in other parts of the world, the equivalent would be public transport. And usually what people are doing at that time is they're entertaining themselves in some way or another. They're listening to music, they're listening to a radio. They might be, if it's in public transport, they might be just browsing through social media, etc. Now imagine if you shifted that and instead were listening to a Torah class in the car, or if public transport is a fiction in our reality. But right, you have no concept of how much you could learn in a year. It's actually shocking how much material a person can cover in a year if they were just listening. And that's passive listening, which doesn't technically fulfill the requirement of Torah learning where you're supposed to say the words, but at the very least, at least you're gaining Torah information. So that would be an indication. I really care about this. Like, I really care about Torah. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm squeezing it in all my spare time. Then I could say Piva Libo Shavin. Then I could say that my stated value, which is I really believe it's important to have a relationship with Hashem, and my lived value is actually the same, because look how important it is to have that relationship. I'm going to stick in time to learn Torah whenever I have an opportunity. And then that could be sitting in the waiting room at the doctor, that could be in between clients in a shop, etc., etc. In fact, I had Dafka today, I was at a particular shop, and we were the only people there. And I was watching the staff as we were walking out. Like, the second we walked out, everybody was on their phones, because there's nothing to do. And you don't realize that happens in the course of a day. Sometimes there are quiet periods where there's nothing to do. And by default, when there's nothing to do, we pull out a phone and we do something which is completely mindless. We would shift that and we would pull out a book. Imagine if a person brought into their workday that, I don't know, twice during the workday, 3 times during the workday, they would take 5 minutes and actually learn something for 5 minutes. Guaranteed by the end of the year, the volume of information that they would have learned would astound them. It's no question. Anyhow, this is not a pep talk about Torah learning, even though it is what he's saying. Rather, what he's telling us over here is that a person has to, in their mind, they have to acknowledge that this is the most valuable thing, is to have a relationship with Hashem. And even if I'm not feeling it absolutely, I'm going to translate it into action. So I'm going to do things whenever I have the opportunity to be able to connect to Hashem. Then, not only will that affect my learning, but it will also affect the other limbs of my body, because they then will go ahead and they'll do mitzvahs, because all mitzvahs which are action-based obviously need parts of the body in order to do them. So what happens now is I'm behaving in line with the thought process that I invested into my life. In other words, I spent time thinking about how valuable it is to have a relationship with Hashem, to embrace Hashem, how my neshama wants that more than anything else. And now I'm actually living accordingly. So now comes, that's the description of how the person behaves. Now comes the part that the Alter Rebbe really wanted to tell us. What's going on inside that person at that time? And this is where things get really interesting. Again, the ideal state is where I have such a profound understanding of Hashem and of the value of a relationship with Hashem, that I actually burn up with excitement and passion to do something about that. So therefore I'm thrilled and I'm driven and I'm completely invested in every possible mitzvah opportunity. That's the ideal state. That's where a Beinoni should be. Here we're talking about the less than ideal state, meaning the person doesn't feel it. Their heart is not pumping with this vibrant love towards Hashem. But this person says, it's actually on balance the most valuable thing in the world. So therefore I'm going to act accordingly even if I don't feel accordingly. Very important. I'm going to act accordingly even if I don't feel accordingly. So then what happens? This is different. It's not fake it. I'm not faking. It's a very important distinction. When people say fake it till you make it, what they're really saying is, I don't buy this principle, but I'm going to keep doing it until I buy this principle. Here we're saying something else. We're saying intellectually, I completely align with this principle. I'm just not feeling it yet. So therefore, I'm doing this because I align with it. There's nothing fake about it. It's just that it hasn't matured to the point that I actually feel it in my heart. Okay, very important distinction. So what's going to happen now? Listen to what happens. This week gets interesting. Harei tavuna zoi. So this tavuna, which we've identified, what is tavuna? Tavuna is that bridge state between pure intellect and emotional response. In other words, tavuna is where my brain says, that's good. I like that. I want to connect with that. I want to subscribe to that. So tavuna zoi mislabeshes b'maise dibur u'machshevas haTorah u'mitzvayseha. That tavuna now embeds itself inside the action that the person is doing, the Torah that they're learning, the mitzvah that they're fulfilling. Okay, he's giving 3 explanations of what happens over here, and we've got to unpack what these 3 things are. However, before we do that, would you agree with the following? If I plug emotion into an action, it's going to be a whole different action. Does that make sense? I think Stan would, either you invented this line or at least you'd agree with this line, where they say, if you're not fired with enthusiasm, you'll be fired with enthusiasm. Right? Which means that, if you plug emotion into a behavior, that behavior is going to be far more energetic, far more invested, far more successful than if you're just plodding along and going through the motions. Right? So, for example, when that husband eventually does bring the flowers on Friday, because he came to the shir and he heard that you're supposed to take flowers for your wife on Friday. So when he comes, if he walks into the house and kind of just like plonks the flowers down on the counter and says, here are your Shabbos flowers, so we clearly know that there was zero emotion in this. He's been coached and he's following what his coach told him, and he appreciates intellectually that there's some value in this. Whereas if you've got somebody who really loves his wife, then he comes home with those flowers and he's excited to see her response. He's excited to give it to her. He's excited to show her that he cares. It's going to be a whole different experience. Even though they're both doing the same activity, the activity is completely different. And by the same token, another great example where you can see this illustrated is on the sports field. So you've got to be obviously very careful which sport you reference and which team you reference in which sport. So we won't talk, for example, about rugby. But you could see the difference between two games played by the same team within a week of each other, where one game, they're a little bit lackluster because we got this and we're a little bit...
too much beer the night before.
They're a little bit too complacent, and we don't have to invest. Whereas the next week, suddenly you're fighting because you've got to prove yourself, and now you've got passion, and it's a completely different game. So in the same way, when we describe how humans behave, we look at the actual behavior, and then we look at the force that pushes that behavior, which is usually emotion. So depending on how much emotion there is, that will determine how much force pushes that behavior, and that will translate into what that behavior actually looks like. Is it just going to be blah-de-blah, or is it going to be on fire? I often think about the example that Dale Carnegie gave in How to Win Friends and Influence People. He tells the story about a guy who came to a public speaking course, and every person in the course had to get up and speak for 1 or 2 minutes unprepared on a topic that was very dear to them. So this guy gets up and he says, I'm going to talk about tractors. He was a farmer. So I'm going to talk about tractors. And you can well imagine that in spite of the fact that the people there were probably not teenagers, they were still all rolling their eyes. And everyone was like, what on earth are we going to have? And he turned out to be the most compelling speaker of the day. Why? Because he had so much passion for the subject that regardless of whether you care about the subject or not, his passion was so strong, it pushed the talk into a different realm, into a different domain that captured everybody's attention. So that's the thing. Usually, when we talk about a person who serves Hashem because they have a love towards Hashem, or even because they feel awe of Hashem, that's going to drive their behavior in such an incredible way. These are the people that are going to be pushing and excited, and when they do a mitzvah, they come to life and they want everybody to participate, right? That's usually how it is. Here we're talking about a person who doesn't have that. Doesn't have that force of emotion behind their behavior. What do they have? They have tavuna. They at least have the intellectual appreciation that this is something worthwhile, and that's why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I actually appreciate the value, even if I'm not feeling that powerful emotion. Says the Alter Rebbe. You know what happens at that point in time? The tavuna, that awareness, that intellectual acceptance, now it embeds itself inside the action, and the action is no longer a dry action. So effectively what he's telling us over here is that you have 3 different kinds of actions or behaviors. The one is literally going through the motions. It's extremely common, unfortunately. A lot of us do that. It's who was that? I think Yeshaya Hanavi, who criticizes the Jewish people and says you're doing mitzvahs anoshim melumada. You're just going through the motions. But it's still a mitzvah. Nobody's going to take that away from you. It's still a mitzvah. In terms of human development, in terms of spiritual connection, very weak spiritual connection, because there's nothing really fueling and pushing that action in a meaningful way. On the opposite extreme, you've got a person who's gushing with love. So now when they're doing a mitzvah, that mitzvah is on fire. You look at them and you also want to do a mitzvah because you see what kind of vitality it brings them. So that would be, for example, where Abraham gets up early in the morning, hops onto the donkey that he saddled himself in, despite the fact he had many servants who could do it. Why? Because he's taking his son up a mountain because Hashem said, I want you to shecht your son. Right? For any of us, we'd be dragging our feet. But because he has such an overwhelming love for Hashem, so even if what he's supposed to be doing right now is this immense challenge, he's doing it with every fiber of his being because that's the power of love. So those two realities are very common to understand and to identify. The Alter Rebbe has just introduced to us a middle ground. The middle ground is the person who doesn't yet have that fiery, passionate connection and commitment, but they have the intellectual appreciation that it should be a fiery commitment, and that intellectual appreciation also gives fuel to the action. So it's no longer just an action, and he identifies three things that it does. One is moichin. It gives you a sense of understanding and appreciation for what you're doing. That makes sense, because obviously if a person has spent time thinking about why this is valuable, then obviously they'll have an intellectual appreciation of the value of what they're doing. That makes sense. The second thing it says is v'chayos, that it will actually give you more energy in that behavior. Now that also makes sense, because if I can see the value of something, I will certainly be more motivated to do it than if I cannot see the value. That makes sense. But then he says something else, gadfen. Gadfen is an Aramaic word. It means wings. So long before Red Bull, we in Tanya already had a formula that gives you wings. Right? So what does it mean? Tfuna gives you wings. What does it mean, gives you wings? To allow the person's mitzvahs to fly on high. Now this is a very, very interesting concept. What do you mean for a mitzvah to fly on high? What does that mean? Very interesting. Much later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is going to come back to this idea of wings, and it's going to point out that a bird can survive without wings. Okay? It will be a disabled bird, but it will survive. It's not a life-sustaining organ, a wing. The bird will not be able to behave like a bird. So in the same way, what's implied over here in calling this wings is that your mitzvah will survive. It will still be a mitzvah, even if it doesn't have the wings. So the person who gets up in the morning bleary-eyed and wraps their tefillin around their arm, and their mind is a million miles away, or probably hasn't even woken up yet, and they blub their way through the davening, at the end of the day, they've got the mitzvah of doing tefillin. They have. So it's not like we're missing the heart or the kidneys. But that mitzvah doesn't have wings. Doesn't have the ability to soar, to fly, to really move upwards. Why not? Because at the end of the day, as powerful as our neshama might be, the reality is we are currently living in a very limited capacity. The human experience is a very limited capacity. Humans are only able to experience 5 senses. Even those 5 senses are very limited. There's certain frequencies of sound we can't hear. There's certain frequencies of light we can't see. We have limited brains, as much as we think we're the smartest people around. The fact is that we have very limited brains. So you take all of the scientists in the world, as the Gemara says, and they still cannot make one wing of one mosquito. So we have those limitations. We have the limitation of space. We can only be in one place at a time. We have the limitation of energy. So we've got to keep replenishing our energy multiple times a day through eating, drinking, sleeping, changing what we're doing, etc. We're living a very limited experience. And because of that, it's not natural that we should be able to catapult the item we did the mitzvah with into another dimension. So we can clock up the value of doing the mitzvah because we did the mitzvah. But how do we have the capacity to take, for example, the parchment that I'm using to make my mezuzah and translate that from being a piece of parchment in this world to becoming a holy item that lives in a spiritual dimension? How do I have the ability to do that? That's why we need wings. Wings allow us to take the stuff of our mitzvahs and to be able to elevate them into another realm. So now we've just learned something really, really important, that it is possible for a person to do a mitzvah, get the credit for doing the mitzvah, without moving the object or the experience that the mitzvah involved to a higher spiritual dimension. That's possible, and it's common. What changes that is the minute we plug in a bit of tavuna. The minute I acknowledge and value why this is a good thing, even if I'm not feeling it, that is already going to lift my mitzvah higher. So we'll end with just a little story. The Baal Shem Tov once came to a shul, and he stood at the door of the shul and he wouldn't walk in. And the people were quite surprised. They said, why don't you come inside the shul? He said, no, there's no space. There's no room inside the shul. So they said, what are you talking about? There's nobody in the shul. He said, yes, but all the prayers that have never elevated are all still stuck in the shul, so there's no room to enter into the shul. And that's this kind of concept. So did I get the credit of doing prayer? Of course I did. I get the mitzvah of doing prayer. But did I have the power to be able to elevate my prayer to where it's supposed to go? That needs wings. And wings usually are deep emotion. Here, the Alter Rebbe is saying, but you can even get wings just from having the concept in your head, having the value as a value that you subscribe to. Okay, we'll unpack this a little bit further because there's a very, very powerful statement coming, which we're going to do, please God, next time.